Today's study is titled LGBT Deity. Now, this is meant to be somewhat instigative and antagonistic, but I also would do you a disservice in not noting that we're going to be discussing some pretty graphic details. So for those that perhaps are under the age where these things could be discussed with candor, I recommend that you listen to another one of our studies. But for those who do adhere to, or at least considering Norse paganism as a belief, or Christians that have questions about the biblical perspective on sexuality and the standards thereof, I encourage you to keep watching and to ask genuine and sincere questions. A culture's view of sexuality is always going to stem from their ultimate standard for morality and from our biological origins. This perspective, of course, came from their religious foundations. So in order to understand whether a particular practice is right or not, in or outside of our sexuality, you need to ask who designed it and what purpose it was intended to fulfill. This is as true for Christianity as it is for paganism and atheism. Now, atheism, for example, notes that the secular society that produced the sexual revolution defines the majority of pop culture today. And within this claim, they say that our origin had no cause. Therefore, there is no standard apart from the purpose that we associate with it. An atheistic or a secular perspective on our sexuality claims we have no origin, therefore no defined standard apart from ourselves. Now note the implications as we continue on. Within Christianity, the Christian perspective on anything is taken from our book and from our man. Jesus of Nazareth himself was sexually abstinent, meaning he didn't participate or have sex during his physical lifetime, but affirmed the Jewish scriptures as the definition of what a right understanding of our sexuality is. Marriage is defined as one man and one woman for one lifetime, based on the historical examples set and affirmed by the God of Christianity with the first man and the first woman. He also affirmed the purpose of sexuality within marriage as twofold. First, the Song of Solomon and the book of Hebrews, Old and New Testament, both affirm and celebrate sexual intimacy between a husband and a wife as honorable and approved of. There's a reason why it feels good to do. God intended for it to be enjoyed as a gift. But also note that reproduction is affirmed as its purpose, as well as in Genesis and in Psalms. Infertility is acknowledged as a defect in ideal function, so noting that going beyond this standard and definition in any capacity is condemned. Now note this is in any form. If it's not your wife, it is sin. If they're not your husband, it is sin. If you have something other than a husband and wife, it is sin, and so forth. But noting this point then and going on into Odinism and Asatru, that given the claims about our origins and by extension the nature of their God, it is from his example that we should discern the ideal example and use of our sexuality in Odinism. And with all the options available to us in the religion of who to look to for that example, there is a good reason to start at the top, given that Odin and his brothers shaped the first man and woman, so they are credited with our biological origin, thus our function, as well as his claim and title of All-Father, the authority that he could enforce over mankind being that example. So how did Odin utilize and thus exemplify for Odinists his sexuality? Well, first of all, he practiced heterosexual marriage. In the Odinist sources, we read that Odin is never described once as having a husband, and he is also mentioned in having a wife named Frigg. In Gylfaginning, section 9 of the Prose Eddas, we read, "There is one abode called Hildskaf, and when the Allfather sat in the high seat there, he looked out over the whole world and saw every man's acts, and he knew all things which he saw. His wife was called Frigg, the daughter of Fingolfin, and of their blood has come the kindred which we call the races of the Aesir, and that have peopled the elder Asgard, and those kingdoms which pertain to it, and that is a divine race. For this reason he must be called All-Father, because he is father of all the gods and of men, and of that was fulfilled of him and of his might." This is also further affirmed in Gylfaginning section 20, where we read, "Thus said Thrindi, Odin is the highest and eldest of the Aesir. He rules all things, and mighty as are the other gods. They all serve him as children, obey a father. Frigg is his wife. So both passages note that not only is Odin responsible for the status of fathering the race of the Aesir and the kingdoms thereof, but also noting as well that to produce these biological offspring, he was married to his wife, Frigg. Second is noting that he was a polygamist. On top of Frigg, who is also known as Freya, there are other giantesses that have borne Odin's legitimate children, thus can lay claim to the title of wife. There are many examples. I'll only mention one because that's all I have to do to show that he was a polygamist. In Gylfaginning, section 9, for this reason he must be called All-Father. Again, this is the same source that we just read, because he is father of all the gods and of men, and of all was fulfilled of him and of his might. The earth was his daughter, and his wife. On her he begot the first son, which is Asa Thor. Strength and prowess attend him, wherewith he overcometh all living things. Now, note, earth in this passage is a reference to the giantess Jord, who is indeed his daughter, and is mentioned in this passage as his wife, not Frigg. So he fathered children through another wife who was called Jord, who was also his daughter. We'll make a casual note about incest, but continue to move on. He regularly committed adultery on his wives. Odin had sexual partners, according to the Odinism sources, that were never called nor considered his wives. In Gylfaginning, section 30, one is called Ali or Vali, son of Odin and Rindr. He is daring in fights and a most fortunate marksman. Now note, Rindr is never mentioned as Odin's wife. She is only mentioned as Vali's mother. Also note that in Skald Skaparmal, as a giantess he seduced in order to produce Baldur's Avenger. It's also worth noting that she was not volunteering for this. We'll add rapist to the list here soon. This is referring to Odin, became a woman in order to participate in a satyr ceremony. The witch, who is sexually violated by spirits and participants alike, is called the vulva. This is referencing that particular part of the female anatomy, as well as the Norse term for a wise woman. When Odin performed this role, Loki makes fun of him for it in one of his many drunken rants within his hall. In the Poetic Edda, in Lokasenna, verse 24, we read, Loki speaking, they say that with spells in Samsi once, like witches with charms didst thou work, and in witches' guise among men didst thou go. Unmanly thou soul must seem. Now, unmanly, of course, was translated from the Old Norse term referring to someone who is pursuing a homosexual lifestyle. But to further emphasize the context, Frigg mentions in the immediate next verse of Lokasenna that Loki has done the same thing. We have plenty of citation to affirm exactly what that was. This is referenced not only in the role of a woman in magical orgies, but also the time he became a woman and gave birth to Odin's horse Sleipnir, which we have direct citation for in Gylfaginning, section 42. And finally, Odin raped women by force of arms, as well as through magic charms. Taking the form of a traveler named Harbarth, he speaks with Thor, not knowing that he's his father. In this encounter, he shares a story of one of his encounters with a maid, whom he met through stealth, and he needed Thor's help holding still. Don't take my word for it. In Harbitsloth 30-32, eastward I was, and spake with a certain one. I played with the linen-white maid, and met her by stealth. I gladdened the gold-decked one, and she granted me joy. Thor spake, full fair was thy woman finding. Harbath spake, thy help did I need then, Thor, to hold the white maid fast. We could also talk about Freya's many affairs, as well as prostituting herself to dwarves for jewelry. We could talk about Thor's unfaithfulness to Sif and vice versa. Loki's behavior is self-explanatory, but this is your paragon for the use of your sexuality, wherever you go in the Norse pantheon. Since he was responsible for forming man from trees with Vili and Vi, his brothers, They're the example for how their designs are used. And in that example, we have a man who has transformed into a woman, transgender, in order to lay with other men, this would qualify him as gay, to perform magic taught to him by his wife, suggesting bisexuality, through whom he has sired the race of the Azir, meaning that if he was a woman at any point, that would mean he was a combination of being lesbian and straight. But with all that said, this would certainly be a god that would be popular among the LGBT community. But understand that in the ancient Norse culture, and affirmed by the writings of Grammaticus and the history of the Danes, these traits describing your god are things that you should be ashamed of in the context that they were written in. And even today, we're not so far gone that rape could be justified alongside these things, especially and as well as adultery in certain situations. But understand, this brings us to the reasons why you need to know all these things. Your God matters because you're trying to become like them. And even if you celebrate the LGBT lifestyle that Odin himself pursued to the fullest, be aware that this includes being a violent rapist and a casual adulterer. I don't believe anyone should make this kind of person their example for how they use their sexuality. If you want a God who not only designed our sexual function, but also had the self-control to not be ruled by it to the point of committing some of the worst atrocities imaginable, I would recommend Jesus Christ. Thank you for your time, and again, I know that this video was provocative, but I still encourage sincere questions, and we'll look forward to discussing these things more with you in the comments below. If you'd like to clarify certain positions or claims that have been made about the Bible regarding sexuality, trust me, I have heard them thousands of times before, and I'll be happy to answer them 1,000 times more, so long as you're listening to the answer. I'll look forward to these conversations, but I want to encourage you as well to note your beliefs matter, and this is why we're doing this. This is why I'm talking about this with you, and why I encourage you to be critical about your spiritual consumption and standards. I look forward to talking to you all next time, hopefully about more, or rather less, crass topics, but such is the case of necessity when we're trying to get to the hearts and minds of men. I look forward to that time where we can discuss these things again, or preferably not, at another time. And until then, I want to remind you that Jesus loves you, and he has far more to offer you than the use, or rather abuse, of sexuality as his example.